Hello and welcome to this update on the Yarslow Model Railway, and today we're looking at sight lines and scenery, and we'll start with sight lines. If you're working here at Yarslow, it's quite easy to look across and have a look at the main line storage sidings. Make sure your train is running so that when you're operating here you know it's on its way to you. And if you're working on the local controller, obviously you can see the yard, the exchange sidings, so it's easy to see what you're doing. At controller D, which is the permanent way yard, obviously is right in front of you, and you can look around into the loop, which is your head shunt. So that's quite an easy place to get a decent sight line. The branch line on a long lead gives you access right down to the traverser, to Blowick Lane, where you can do some shunting, and then the other way all the way up to Butterbump, where again you can do some shunting. At the storage sidings you've got the mainline controllers. Obviously you can see the trains, you've got the repeater lights, and you can see what's happening at Yarslow if you're bringing a train round from Yarslow. And at Trinity Square you bring trains in from Midworth, and you can see over the top of the central divide these sidings at the front here where these carriages are. This is Midworth. You can see those trains as they depart on their way towards you, running behind the control panel and around the loop there, and eventually arriving here. But it's a bigger problem if you're working at Yarslow and you want to run a train along the branch towards Yarslow. Bear in mind that we operate our trains from the point of arrival. You can't see over this central divide because it's too tall, unless you're about 8'6" tall. So you can't see over the top there to see whether your train has left. At the storage sidings, when you're operating at Midworth, you've got the same problem in reverse, in that you can't see over the centre divide to see if your train has left Trinity Square. You can normally hear a train running, but is it the right train? And that's where this lovely box comes in. This is the old CCTV from the old layout that's been revamped. 4 cameras, so that I can now start to take a look around the layout. The wiring will disappear underneath in due time. I've got the screen perched just for testing for the minute, and the camera is somewhat balanced just to see if this is going to work for me. So from here, to run a train out of the branch, which is over there, easy to do when you've got the camera on the end of your arms, I'm using this camera up here in the rafters, fixed in and screwed in, and this is what appears on the screen: Trinity Square on the left, branch on the right. Butterbump can be spied using this camera mounted on the side of the fascia board, and just behind it here I've got another camera looking at the lever frame at Middle Junction. It's important that if you're standing at Yarslow you know what's going on there. A little remote control enables me to flick around the screens. This is what you normally see: 4 channels, 1 camera not working at the minute. I seem to have broken one, but there's channel 1 with the branch and Trinity Square that we saw just now. There's 2 in the foreground. You can see Middle Junction lever frame, and there's a bonus, the exit from the storage sidings in the background. Channel 3 is that camera that's looking at Butterbump, and eventually I'll have one looking at the approach through Middle Junction as well, and that will appear in the bottom left of these 4 screens. So this is the easy part of the job. If you're working here at Trinity Square, you can see your train depart the Midworth sidings, running around behind the control panel and on the line. There we go. up towards Middle Junction, and eventually you can see it on the camera there of Middle Junction. You can see the levers are set correctly for that manoeuvre, and eventually it arrives under the bridge and into Trinity Square Station, running past the signal box and the water tower and arriving in platform 2. You can see why it's important to control at the point of destination. Get your stops right. Signals go green, and in reverse we're now operating this train from the Midworth sidings, the storage sidings. So using the camera I can see that the right train is now leaving platform 3 at Trinity Square. You can always hear it as long as you know it's the right train, and then it duly arrives. You can see around the end of the branch, in fact you can see the train coming through Middle Junction. I did have a camera here when the other one was working, and it might get replaced when it turns up from eBay. And then it comes, the train comes through the storage sidings here, behind all the wiring, and goes into the storage siding at Midworth to complete the manoeuvre. And again, you have controlled this train at the point of its destination. Now here's a branch train being operated from Yarslow, again using the cameras. I can see the train, the DMU, running through Blowick Lane on that camera we used before, and here's channel 4 showing me Butterbump, and the train arrives at Butterbump. Usually of course this would be operated on the branch controller, but I'm just making a point that you can do this today. And then when nobody gets on and nobody gets off, as usual, the train can then depart, and then it'll appear on screen at Yarslow, and of course once you can see it, it's easy to control. Now I've been doing other things. I've been putting fascia boards on, doing some filling, making it look pretty, filling in the screw holes. This will get painted green eventually. Permanently mounting the station signs that I've got, finishing off the stables with the track plans. Really pleased with the way these stables have come out. They need bedding in of course, but they just blend in behind the J72, doing some shunting in the yard. And these are the trees that came from the old Yarslow layout, which you'll remember ran along the back wall. They didn't travel very well in our move to the northwest. They all came up in a big plastic crate, and they're all rather flat, so they need to be painted and flattened out. And Ian's tree, looking the part. Got another fascia that I've just finished to go on there. That'll finish that corner off rather nicely, methinks. And on this front corner I've started to experiment with scenery. So there's all sorts of layers in here of static grass and clump foliage and lichen, and I'm really pleased with the way that's come out. 3 or 4 different lengths of static grass, different textures, coarse grass, flock, all sorts of things. And that's been my little practice area right at the front here. So I've moved on to the embankment. I've gone to do the static grassing here. I've moved away from Javis using my WWS grass applicator. The Javis stuff tended to clump, so I've moved on to Geek Gaming and PS Studios, I think they call themselves, and it's been a lot better. So nothing against Javis, but it does go a bit clumpy. And I've used 4, 6 and 10 mil grasses, all sorts of colours mixed in together to get this blend. A lot more work to do here, but this is first stage of probably 5 or 6. I've got to build up along the back, get the fencing in. The fencing's got to go all the way down the back of the layout. So whilst that's all been drying, I've been playing around with these shops at Bridge Street again. Got to this stage. I've started with the bicycle shop on the far left with a bicycle in the window. The Undertakers with a bit of stonework in the window. Next door is the ladies' fashion shop, a couple of plastic figures with their heads cut off in the window. And finally a book and coin shop with the stained glass window. Curtains and a kind of suggestion of an interior has been added. A little sign that I think came with a Metcalf kit. The roof has been done and the guttering added. The white bits, incidentally, are for the transfers for the names of the shops. I've got some transfer paper that I can print on in my printer, but of course you can't print white letters. So I've got to print blank letters on a coloured background, and in order to make those letters white, you need to print or paint the colour onto the shop. So the other two brown ones are fine, but the red and the black just need a bit of white as a bit of background. So having been quite pleased with the way my experimental corner came out, I've now flocked the tree from Ian and moved on 3 or 4 days after this last bit of video was shot to do the background. I've put some trees in to hide the branch exit. The fences are in, the lichens and the clump foliage and the static grass and the coarse grass and the other phlox have all gone in. There's about 5 or 6 layers here, detailing around the wall with all those various layers, different lengths of grass, different colours of grass, trying to represent nature. Always useful to have reference books handy to look at the sort of state the railway's in the 60s or whatever era you're modelling. All this lichen will be painted and flocked in due course. This is base layer for the hedging, really. The trees have been rescued. Bear in mind, under trees that not a lot grows, so you'll see a lot of just base layer under the trees, very little grass. And you can see the grass has started to invade between the main line and the goods loop. It's still wet here, you can still see the PVA. But the grass peters out as you get further down towards the station, which you'd expect. Heavier foot traffic and more use. But that's good. I'm beginning to like it. We come down now past the branch junction, fewer trees, but where the fence comes forward, an opportunity to really go to town with all the various different layers, 5 or 6 different layers of scenery in here to get all those textures that you need. Maybe not finished yet. Occasional tree, smaller trees, big bushes. Again, use reference photographs, don't make it up, follow nature itself. It's a remarkable stuff, nature. Down behind the line side hut, and then the fence joining up with the wall behind the station, the trees just providing a link between that back wall and the back scene. Here's the gents, it's all painted up and weathered. Don't look ladies, but in the weathering that's what gents' loos look like, I'm afraid. Yeah, nasty. And then down, put a little bit of spear fencing I'm playing around with to the building. Here's a little job, it took about 30 seconds. It makes such a difference. This gate, which is glued to the platform and to the wall, not the building, but just linked the wall to the building, and suddenly the building became part of the station rather than just something that was plonked on top of the platform. Fences going in behind the station. Ignore the things holding the fences up for the minute, the glue was still drying, but the fences have gone in just to make that entrance way. And then the 2 silver birches, these are woodland scenic trees, these are really quite nice. They are going to sit around the cottage and hide the corner seam behind the cottage, whilst the railway fence and the scenery comes around the front behind Yarslow South, behind the permanent way depot, and all the way down into this corner. And I've been experimenting in the longer grass with some flock, and just brush the top with glue and scatter your flock to get red flowers These white ones are a bit too white for me, they need to be a little creamer. But I like that red mauve and a little bit of yellow combination thing going on. And don't ask me what these flowers are, I'm no gardener. This looks quite crude close up, but from a distance it's good. And you can see these are probably salvias or something along the line side. And now the buildings start to sit into the scenery. They're not just models plonked on the top. A little bit of flowers around the signal box. You can see the grass around the bottom of the wall. The lichens behind the signal box to give it a bit of a background. And this is earlier in the process. This is just static grass and a little bit of coarse grass on the ground between the main lines and the loop, the other side of the overbridge. I've got obviously some work to do where I've got a bit excited with the filler, but this is very early stage. This is probably layer 1 or 2 of 6. And I've used some of this poly fibre. This is stuff that you tease out to make a very fine Brillo pad, but it's very soft. Glue it down with contact adhesive, and then you can sprinkle stuff over the top and make kind of large bushes that are quite airy. A very different texture to the lichen bushes, which clearly need to be painted, but have got a much more organic structure to them. And of course some of the lichen colours are a little alien, so that's going to need colouring before we do anything to that. But here's my experiment. You know I love to experiment with things. I'd rather make a hash of it here than on the layout. So this was my first go at doing polyfibre bushes. And whilst that's not brilliant, I learnt a lot. You know, this is what you do. Make a mess off the layout rather than make a mess on the layout. Where the road bridge goes over, I've used the polyfibre pulled into a long thin shape to make a hedge. I'll join it up with the fencing when the glue is dry. But hedges either side of the road, so that's the impression you're going to get of the road as it leaves the station and heads off somewhere. And I've used polyfibre bushes again in the waste ground behind the approach road. You can see the rocky surface, all the textures of the clump foliage and the lichen and some coarse grass in there. This is a long way from finished, but the texture's beginning to happen and build up. And then the piece of ground at the front I haven't done anything with, so this is just by comparison. This is what base layer looks like. There's one piece of polyfibre stuck in there. And this is what we look like now as you come down the main line towards Yarslow, and I'm quite like the look of that. The buildings beginning to look as if they sit into the scenery and into the countryside, and the Yarslow is turning into a place in the countryside as opposed to just being a model of somewhere and buildings and track. So now the trains, when they run through, start to look as if they're running through a place. It's quite different. If you look at an older video without the scenery in the background, it does actually look quite different. Do bear in mind when you look at this that Yarslow is meant to be in North Lincolnshire. It's pretty flat. It's a billiard table of a place really. So that's my excuse for keeping the scenery quite low key. No mountains and hills, no back scene showing mountains and hills. And I've been really pleased with the way that I've been able to use buildings and trees to hide the entrance and the exit of the main line. There are some bumpy bits of course. And as you'd expect, if you're going to run a railway line through a bumpy bit, it tends to be a branch line rather than a main line. So that's my excuse for the overbridges that appear at Butterbump and at Blowick Lane. But generally, the place is pretty flat. Yarslow, of course, is a fairly insignificant place. And most trains, like this southbound Saturdays Only Express, go straight past the place without so much of a look. Even the lowly coal trains don't bother much. as they plod through on their way south. Although early morning during the week we do get one that stops for water, and that passes for excitement. It's the junction of the High Marsh branch, of course, which means we do get a regular stopping passenger service, a bit like this B17 heading north with a typical rake of Thompson coaches. And that's about it for this update, so thank you for joining along. Hope you've enjoyed another trip to Yarslow and its surrounding environs. Coming up, of course, we've got the start of the new series of bite-sized bits based on the things that you guys wanted to see. Hopefully by the end of June, the next update, the scenery at Yarslow will be very much done. I'll be back doing some more scenery on the branch. I'll be touching in and doing a bit more of those buildings at Trinity Square, because I really am driving forward to try and get the layout as basically as finished, if there ever is such a thing, as possible by the end of the year. Thanks for sticking along. Happy modelling. I'll see you soon.